Claire's day began like any other, with the same routine that had become second nature over the years. She woke up at dawn, the light filtering softly through the curtains as she stretched in the comfort of her bed. The air smelled of fresh coffee, which Gary always brewed before she even stirred. It was a small ritual he had maintained since the early days of their marriage. She dressed in silence, her mind distant as she mentally checked off her to-do list. The to-do list for the day: breakfast was the usual fare, eggs on toast with a slice of fruit. Simple, but enough to start the day. She set the plates on the table. Gary appeared in the doorway. His tie slightly askew, he gave her a soft smile and kissed her cheek, lingering a little longer than usual. "Happy anniversary, honey," he said, his voice full of the kind of warmth that had once made her heart skip a beat. "Happy anniversary, Claire," she replied, her tone lighter and almost automatic. She forced a smile, but her thoughts were already drifting elsewhere. Gary pulled out a chair and sat down. Oblivious to Gary was clearly upset about something. He talked about his plans for the day, the dinner reservation he had made at Letty Bistro, and how he couldn't wait to see her in the new dress he'd bought. Claire nodded along, responding with the appropriate level of enthusiasm, but her mind was already on Jake. Jake had joined her company a year ago, and he'd brought with him a presence that was impossible to ignore. He was charming, confident, and flirtatious, a stark contrast to the steady, reliable man she'd known at first. It was just harmless banter, an innocent distraction from the monotony of her workday. But over time the touches became more intense and deliberate. Claire found herself drawn to Jake in ways she hadn't felt in years, and it terrified her how quickly she fell into the thrill of it all as she cleared the breakfast dishes. Claire's phone buzzed with a message from Jake. "Can't wait to see you tonight, my place at 7. She quickly glanced over her shoulder to make sure Gary wasn't watching before typing a quick response. "See you then." Gary was gathering his things and preparing to leave for the office. He paused at the door and turned back to look at her with a fond expression. "Don't work too hard today." "Okay, I want you all." He said to himself, "I won't," with a grin. Claire promised, forcing another smile. Kitchen, staring at the spot where he had been just moments before. She knew what she was about to do was wrong. Deep down, she knew it was a betrayal of everything they had built together over the past 26 years, but she couldn't resist the pull towards Jake. By noon, the guilt was too much to bear. She picked up her phone and texted Gary, typing out a lie that came too easily. "Hey, something urgent came up at work. I might be a bit late for dinner. Don't wait up for me if it gets too late. I'll make it up to you, I promise." His response came almost immediately. "No. Worry, sweetheart. We'll celebrate whenever you get home. Love you." The sincerity in his words cut through her like a knife for a brief moment. Claire considered canceling on Jake and going through with the dinner Gary had so carefully planned. But the thought of spending the night in the predictable comfort, the same routine that had become a bit much for her, made her feel trapped as the clock inched closer to 5. Claire slipped into the dress Gary had chosen for her. It was a beautiful piece, elegant and understated, something that would have made her feel special under different circumstances. But tonight, it felt like a costume, a disguise for the role she was about to play. She looked at herself in the mirror, taking in the image of a woman who was about to make a choice that could shatter everything. The reflection stared back at her, eyes wide with a mixture of anticipation and dread. With one last look around the house, Claire grabbed her purse and car keys and headed out the door, not towards the restaurant where her husband was waiting, but to Jake's apartment where a different kind of thrill awaited her. As she drove away, the guilt that had been gnawing at her slowly, the sadness she felt, was replaced by the intoxicating rush of anticipation for just one night. She convinced herself she could have it all as she drove to Jake's apartment. The excitement was building inside her, and the city lights blurred by her thoughts racing faster than the traffic she kept telling herself she told. Herself that this was just one night, a single night of indulgence, of stepping out of her comfort zone. Her rational mind, the one that usually kept her grounded, was drowned out by the intoxicating thrill of what she was about to do when she arrived. Jake was waiting for her he was holding a bottle of wine and had a cheeky grin on his face. "You look stunning," he said, looking her up and down as he pulled her inside. Claire felt a warm glow at his words. It was a kind of compliment that she'd not had much of in her marriage. Inside the apartment, the lighting was low and the air was thick, the room was filled with the scent of candles and something else, something musky and intoxicating that made her head spin. Jake poured them each a glass of the expensive red wine, a luxury that Claire seldom indulged in. As they clinked glasses, she couldn't help but notice the way his eyes lingered on hers, the unspoken promise. They started with small talk and eased into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Jake had a way of making her laugh. His humor was sharp and unfiltered. They reminisced about work and shared stories about their colleagues, and joked about the absurdity of office politics. It felt easy and effortless, like the kind of conversation that had been missing from her life for so long. The wine flowed freely, loosening the last of Claire's inhibitions. They moved from the kitchen to the living room, where Jake put on some music, something upbeat and carefree that made her feel young. He took her hand again and pulled her into a dance that was more about laughter than grace. They twirled around the room, stumbling over each other's feet and collapsing onto the couch in fits of giggles. For a moment, Claire forgot about everything else. She wasn't a wife, a mother, or an employee. She was just a Claire was caught up in the excitement of the night, which felt like a dream. Jake's hands on her waist, his breath against her ear, it all felt thrillingly new, and yet comfortably familiar as the night wore on. The playful teasing between them turned into something deeper and more intense. The looks they exchanged became charged with unspoken desire. The way they looked at each other became more intense. The touches were longer and more deliberate when Jake leaned in to kiss her. It wasn't a tentative gesture, but a bold declaration. Claire responded in kind, and the electricity between them ignited a spark that quickly turned into a blaze. The apartment was forgotten as they were lost in each other for the rest of the night. It was a blur of passionate kisses and tangled limbs. Claire felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Every nerve ending was on fire and every sensation was heightened by the forbidden nature of their tryst. Jake was everything Gary wasn't. He was spontaneous. Jake was adventurous and a little bit dangerous, and there were no expectations or obligations, just pure, unfiltered desire. Claire let herself get swept away, her body responding to every touch and every whisper, as if she had been starved for this kind of attention for far too long. They moved from the couch, they went to bed, getting undressed and getting rid of any last doubts along the way. In the dim light, with the city glowing faintly outside the windows, they found themselves entwined in the sheets. The world outside was a distant memory for a while. There was no past, no future, only the present. In the aftermath, as they lay side by side, their breathing still heavy, Claire felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. She felt satisfied, but also a little uneasy. She pushed it down, reminding herself that this was just a momentary escape. She could compartmentalize this, tuck it away in a corner. She tried to push the thoughts away and go back to her life with Gary as if nothing had happened. But deep down, she knew better. The line had been crossed, the boundaries blurred. Claire tried to convince herself that it was just a fling that she could walk away from. She was still a little hurt, but as she looked over at Jake, still flushed from their encounter, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. For now, though, she chose to stay in the moment, savoring the fleeting sense of freedom and exhilaration. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight she was someone else, someone who lived for the thrill of the moment. Consequences be damned. The night had slipped by in a blur of passion and laughter. The hours blended together until the world outside seemed to disappear entirely. It was well past midnight when Claire finally thought to check her phone. She reached over to the nightstand, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of her screen. As soon as she saw the notifications, a cold dread settled in the pit of her stomach. There were several missed calls from Gary, each one time-stamped later and later into the evening. Her heart began to race, and 1,000 thoughts swirled in her mind as she opened the first text message. "You deserve each other. Enjoy." She paused, her breath catching as she read the next line. "But guess what? You're now homeless. I'm going to sleep with your sister." Claire's hands trembled as she held the phone. She felt a wave of nausea rise within her, a sickening realization that everything had just come crashing down. The final blow came in the form of an image, her wedding rings, discarded in a trash can. It was a brutal symbol of the life she had just destroyed. How had he found out? What had he done? And what did he mean by homeless? The questions pummeled her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. Jake stirred beside her, mumbling something as he shifted under the covers. CLA didn't even register what he said. Her entire focus was on the disaster that was unfolding. She had to get out. She had to figure out what was happening. She threw the covers off, her movements frantic as she scrambled to get dressed. She quickly got dressed. Her clothes were all over the floor, a reminder of the night she now wished she could erase. She pulled on her dress and caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked disheveled and panicked, a far cry from the confident woman who had walked through Jake's door just hours before. Kla sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice groggy with sleep. "I have to go," she stammered, her mind too chaotic to form a coherent explanation. "I just have to leave," she added, before grabbing her purse, and she barely glanced at her phone as she rushed out of the office and down the stairs. The sound of the door slamming echoed in her ears as she rushed out into the cool night air. Her car was parked a few blocks away, and the walk seemed to stretch on forever as her thoughts spiraled out of control. What had Gary done? The thought of him sleeping with her sister was too horrifying to contemplate, but it was the word homeless that made her most anxious. Had he kicked her out? Was there even a home to go back to? Claire's hands shook as she fumbled with her keys, finally managing to unlock the car and slide into the driver's seat. She was breathing in short, uneven gasps. The silence of the car was deafening, broken only by the irregular beat of her heart as she drove through the empty streets. Her mind was racing to piece together what had happened. Had Gary been suspicious? Had someone seen her with Jake and told him? The possibilities were endless, one more terrifying than the last. Her phone buzzed again, startling her out of her thoughts. She glanced down at the screen, half expecting another venomous message from Gary. But it was just a notification from her sister Nancy, inviting her to lunch the next day. Kla almost laughed at the absurdity of it. How could her sister had no idea that their world was on the brink of imploding? The drive home felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes as she pulled into her driveway. The sight that greeted her was both familiar and alien. The house stood in the darkness, silent and foreboding, a stark contrast to the warmth it had once held. The house was different now. It was cold and dark, and she felt uneasy as she sat in the car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. She had to summon the courage to face whatever awaited her inside. She thought back to the night with Jake, the thrill and passion, and it all felt like a distant memory now, eclipsed by the reality she had to confront. Kla stepped out of the car and felt the cool night air on her skin as she approached the front door. She reached for the handle, her heart pounding in her chest, braced for what she knew was about to unfold. As Claire turned into the driveway, the stillness of the night seemed unnaturally heavy. The house was there ahead, a silhouette in the darkness that no longer felt like home. The absence of Gary's car was the first sign that something was wrong, but she tried to push the feeling aside. Perhaps he was out, cooling off, trying to collect his thoughts after discovering her betrayal. She had a hollow, aching feeling in her chest, and it was clear to her that something was wrong. She fumbled with the keys, her fingers shaking as she tried to fit the right one into the lock. The door swung open with a low creak, and she stepped inside. She was immediately engulfed by an eerie silence. The familiar warmth of their home had been replaced by a chilling emptiness. Kla reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out, so she had to navigate the darkness by the pale glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Her foot caught on something as she took a step forward, and she nearly tripped. Bending down, she realized it was a shattered picture frame. Glass shards scattered across the wooden floor. She picked up the piece of glass and held it up to the light. It was a photo from their wedding day. The glass was now cracked through the middle, splitting their smiling faces in two. Her heart twisted as she stared at it. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her like a vice. As she moved further into the house, it became clear that Gary was really angry. Furniture was upended. Cushions were thrown open, stuffing spilling out. Books and papers were strewn everywhere. It was like a war zone, and Claire felt as it was the walls that stopped her in her tracks. What had once been a gallery of memories, family photos, framed art, and tokens of a shared life, was now a canvas of fury, spray-painted words screaming at her from every direction. Liar, cheater, 304. The last one stung the most, though. Betrayal. Her breath caught in her throat as she stumbled through the house, each step revealing more destruction. The kitchen, where they had shared countless meals, was a disaster. Cabinets were hanging open, their contents strewn across the floor. The refrigerator door was ajar, with food spoiling in the darkness. The dining table, the centerpiece of their home, was in a terrible state. The living room, where they had once enjoyed watching movies together, was completely destroyed. The TV was smashed, the couch slashed, and even the fireplace, once a cozy spot, was cold and desecrated. The ashes from their last fire were scattered across the floor. It was a shocking sight. When she got to the bedroom, she realized just how much damage Gary had done. The bed where they'd slept together for so many nights was stripped bare. The mattress was leaning against the wall as if he'd thrown it in a rage. In the middle of the room, where their bed had been, there was a single envelope. Stark against the emptiness, Claire's hands were shaking as she picked it up. She had a feeling something bad was going to happen. She tore open the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper with Gary's familiar handwriting on it. It read, "I hope it was worth it." The words felt like a knife twisting in her gut. She continued reading, her vision blurring with tears. "Everything we built together was gone. Everything we built together is gone. Don't bother trying to find me. I'll be long gone by the time you read this. Enjoy your new life. Oh, and say hi to your sister for me." The notes slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. Claire collapsed beside them. Her legs gave out as the weight of Gary. She was devastated. She had never imagined he was capable of something like this. The man she had taken for granted, the man she had deceived, had turned her world upside down in the most brutal way possible. She looked around the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Everything she had known, everything she had, the thought that she was safe and certain, was gone. Gary had torn through their life together like a hurricane, leaving nothing but devastation in his wake. The realization that she had brought this upon herself was almost too much to bear. Sobs racked her body as she curled up on the cold, hard floor. The life she had once known was in ruins. All she could do was weep for what she had lost and for what she had destroyed. The days following Gary's brutal revenge were a blur of panic and desperation for Clay. She barely slept, consumed with fear and regret. Every morning she woke up hoping it had all been a nightmare, but the devastation in her once cozy home was a stark reminder that her world had crumbled. She tried frantically to reach Gary, but each attempt only deepened her despair. His phone number, which had once been a lifeline, was now disconnected, and his social media profiles had vanished as if he had never existed. She called his friends, his colleagues, and she even tried to contact Gary's family, but they were either unhelpful or evasive. Nobody seemed to know where he was, and if they did, they weren't telling her. There was a clear sense of pity in their voices, which made her realize that word of her affair had spread like wildfire. She could feel the judgment in every conversation, the unspoken condemnation that followed her everywhere she went. It wasn't until she tried to access their bank accounts that she realized just how bad her situation was. The accounts were empty, completely drained. She was panicking as she searched through the paperwork, desperately trying to find out what had happened. That's when she found the documents that Gary had transferred ownership of the house to himself weeks before, and then sold it without her knowledge. CLA was left with nothing, no money, no home, and no way to fight back. The reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. She was homeless and penniless. And she was utterly alone, feeling the shame of her actions like a heavy burden. She felt like she was being watched, as if the whole world knew about her betrayal. Her once orderly life had fallen apart, and she was powerless to stop it from happening. As time went on, Claire realized that Gary had been planning his revenge. He had been suspicious for some time, watching her and noting her late nights at work and the distance between them. Eventually, he hired a private investigator to follow her, take photos, and compile a report. There was enough evidence to confirm his worst fears. Gary had known about her affair and had planned his retaliation so meticulously that TLA felt hollow. She had underestimated the man she had thought would always be there. He had dismantled her life with surgical precision. She had underestimated him, and now she was paying the price. The final blow came a few weeks later. A few weeks later, she received a plain white envelope in the mail. At first, Claire thought it might be another bill or a reminder of her now precarious situation. But when she opened it, her blood ran cold. It was an invitation. Simple, elegant, and utterly devastating. The invitation was from her sister Nancy, inviting her to a wedding. The groom's name. Claire stared at the invitation, her hands shaking so much she could barely hold it. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes, and the words on the paper swam in and out of focus. She read it again, hoping she'd misunderstood or that her eyes were playing tricks on her. But the name was there, clear as day. Gary, her husband or ex-husband. She sank into a chair, feeling the weight of what she had done crushing her from all sides. Gary had found a way to make things even worse for her by getting close to her sister. She felt betrayed by both of them. In the days that followed, Claire tried to find the strength to fight back and salvage some part of her life. She consulted lawyers, but the divorce papers, the papers that arrived after the incident, left her with no way to get back at Gary. He'd been thorough, making sure she had no way to reach out to him and ask for forgiveness. When she tried to, he only responded through his lawyer. The divorce was final, and there was no way back. As the wedding date approached, she found herself sinking. Gary's revenge had been total. She was sunk deeper into despair, unable to escape the consequences of her actions. All she had left was the bitter taste of regret and the shattered remnants of a life she had once taken for granted. The invitation sat on her kitchen table, a constant reminder of the life she had lost. As the days slipped by, Claire realized that she was truly alone, left to grapple with the choices that had led her to this point, on the day of the wedding. The day dawned with a gray, oppressive sky that seemed to mirror Claire's mood. She stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, trying to summon the courage to face what lay ahead. Her hands trembled as she applied makeup, each stroke of the brush a futile attempt to mask the turmoil churning inside her. The dress she wore was a simple black sheath, the only thing that seemed appropriate for the joyous occasion she was about to witness. She drove to the venue. Claire was filled with regret and desperation. Nancy and Gary had always been close, but she had never imagined it would end this way. The invitation, with its elegant script and cruel implications, felt like the final nail in the coffin of her old life. But she still clung to some shred of hope that seeing Gary would help. If only she could talk to him, she could somehow make things right. The wedding was held in a quaint little chapel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place she and Gary might have chosen themselves in another life. As CLA stepped out of her car and approached the entrance, she felt eyes on her. They were sharp, judging eyes that seemed to pierce through her. It was as if everyone knew who she was and what she had done, and they all silently condemned her for it. Inside, the atmosphere was festive, a stark contrast to the tension outside. To the storm brewing in Claire's heart, she could feel the disdain radiating from every corner. There was a palpable tension that made her want to turn and run, but she didn't. She couldn't. Claire's heart sank as she caught sight of her sister Nancy standing at the front of the chapel. Nancy was dressed in a simple but elegant white gown. She looked radiant. Her face was glowing with happiness. Claire couldn't help but notice the subtle similarities between the dress Nancy wore now and the dress she'd worn on her own wedding day. A small, bitter reminder of the life that was no longer hers. Nancy's eyes met Claire's briefly before moving on, as if she were just another face in the crowd. There was no warmth, no acknowledgement of the bond they once shared. The cold indifference in Nancy's gaze cut deeper than any words could. It was clear that whatever relationship they had once had was now as broken as Claire's marriage. Gary's expression was unreadable as he took in the scene before him. When his eyes met Claire's, there was no trace of the man she had once loved. The warmth and kindness that had defined him were gone, replaced by a cold, calculating satisfaction. He had one, and they both knew it. He didn't need to say a word. The look in his eyes was enough to convey the depth of his victory. Claire was no longer the woman he loved, but the enemy he had vanquished. The ceremony began, and Claire found herself sitting in the back row, isolated from the rest of the guests. The words of the officiant washed over her like a distant echo, drowned out by the roar of her own thoughts. She watched as Gary and Nancy exchanged vows. Their voices were steady and filled with the conviction of a future together. Each word was a reminder of what she had lost and what she had thrown away. As the couple exchanged rings, Claire's vision blurred with tears. The gold the bands shone in the candlelight, a stark contrast to the ones that had been discarded in the trash. This was supposed to be her life, her marriage, her happiness, but it was all gone now. Swept away by the tidal wave of her own mistakes, when the officiant declared them husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause, the sound crashing over Calais like a wave. She remained seated, her hands clenched in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. The pain was a welcome distraction. Gary and Nancy sealed their union with a kiss, and Claire felt the last of her hopes slip away. The life she had known was truly over, and there was no going back. All that remained was a bitter aftertaste of regret, and the knowledge that she had only herself to blame. When the ceremony ended and the guests began to file out of the chapel, Claire remained seated, her eyes fixed on the floor. She couldn't bring herself to move. She had come here hoping for a chance to make things right, but all she found was the cold, hard truth. Gary had moved on, and he had done so with the one person she had never expected to betray her. Eventually, she stood up and made her way to the exit. The celebration continued around her, but it felt like a world apart, a place where she no longer belonged, as she stepped out. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Scylla realized that she was truly alone. The world she had once known was gone, replaced by a harsh, unforgiving reality. As she walked away from the chapel, she knew that she could never return to the life she had lost. The months after the wedding were some of the hardest of Claire's life. Each day felt like an uphill battle as she tried to navigate the wreckage of the life she had once known, with nowhere else to turn. In a small, cramped apartment on the edge of town, it was a far cry from the spacious home she had shared with Gary, but it was all she could afford after he had taken everything. The walls were thin, the furniture was sparse, and the loneliness was suffocating. Claire threw herself into her work, taking on extra shifts and freelance projects to make ends meet. The routine was grueling, but it kept her mind occupied, numbing the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. The affair with Jake, which had once been an exhilarating escape, quickly lost its appeal without the secrecy. Their connection faded, leaving CLA feeling even more isolated. Jake stopped calling, and Claire didn't bother to reach out. Their relationship had been built on lies and deceit, and without that foundation, there was nothing left to salvage. As CLA struggled to rebuild her life, Gary and Nanny's world seemed to flourish effortlessly. Social media became a double-edged sword. It was a double-edged sword, a painful reminder of the happiness she had lost, and the life she had inadvertently created for them. She couldn't help but scroll through their posts, each one a dagger to her heart. There were photos of exotic vacations, their new house, and eventually the announcement that Nancy was pregnant. Gary's smile in those photos was wide and genuine, a stark contrast to the last time CLA had seen him. She was acutely aware that he was thriving in his new life while she was barely scraping by, and it filled her with a toxic mix of bitterness and regret. Gary's pictures were wide and genuine, which was a stark contrast to the last time CLA had seen him. She knew that Gary was thriving in his new life while she was barely scraping by, and it filled her with a toxic mix of bitterness and regret. But there was nothing she could do. The life she had known was gone, and no amount of wishing could bring it back.